There is a law operating in your life right now that you have never been taught. And the reason you have never been taught it is not because it is hidden or secret or reserved for a chosen few. It is because most people, including most of the scientists and teachers and thinkers who should understand it, have been looking at it from exactly the wrong angle their entire lives. They have been studying what it does while completely missing what it is. And what it is, when you finally see it clearly, when the angle shifts and the whole thing comes into focus at once, is the single most destabilizing and liberating recognition a human consciousness can have about the nature of its own existence. I am going to tell you what this law is. But I am not going to tell you right now. I want to take you to it, the way it actually needs to be approached, through the evidence, through the mechanism, through the specific way it operates in the texture of your daily experience. Because if I hand you the law as a clean statement before you have felt it from the inside, it will become another idea you carry around. Another thing you heard once that sounded profound and then dissolved into the background noise of your day by Thursday. This law does not work that way. This law, when it lands correctly, does not sound like a new idea. It sounds like a memory, like something you knew once and somehow forgot, like the ground reappearing under your feet after years of walking on nothing. So, before anything else, I want to ask you something I want you to sit with genuinely rather than answer immediately and move past. Think about the last time something really changed in your life. Not a small adjustment, not a new routine or a different job or a different city. A real change. The kind that reached down into the structure of how you moved through your days and rearranged something fundamental about your experience of being alive. Now think about what preceded that change. Not what you did in the weeks and months before it. What shifted internally, below the level of strategy and decision and conscious intention in the period right before the outer change became visible. Because here is what I have observed across years of studying the people whose lives seem to operate by entirely different rules than the people around them. The ones who change most completely, most quickly, most permanently, they all describe the same internal event happening just before the external shift became real. Not a new technique, not a better habit. Something more fundamental, a change in what they were willing to see. Hold that, because it is the thread that leads directly to the law I am about to give you. And by the time we arrive there together, you will already know it. Not because I taught it to you, because you recognized it in yourself. In 1982, a physicist named Alain Aspect conducted an experiment in a laboratory outside Paris that should have permanently rewritten everything humanity understood about the nature of reality. It did not, mostly because the implications were so disturbing that even the scientific community largely chose to file it under fascinating and move on, rather than actually follow the thread to where it leads. But the experiment happened. The results were confirmed. They have been replicated hundreds of times since with increasing precision and increasingly impossible to ignore implications. And what Aspect proved that day in 1982 is the foundation on which everything I am about to tell you rests. What he proved was something that Albert Einstein had spent years insisting was impossible. That two particles, once connected, remain connected regardless of the distance between them. That when you measure one of those particles and change its state, the other particle responds instantaneously, not after a delay proportional to the distance, not through any signal traveling through space, instantaneously, as if the space between them is not real in the way we assume space to be real, as if separation itself is, at some fundamental level, a feature of the way we are observing, rather than a feature of what is actually there. Einstein called this spooky action at a distance, and he genuinely hated it. Not because he was stubborn, but because he understood what it meant. If particles could influence each other instantaneously across any distance, then the universe was not the solid, independent, mechanically predictable place that physics since Newton had assumed. It meant that things appearing separate were actually connected beneath the visible. It meant that observation, the act of a conscious entity directing attention towards something, was not a passive act of witness. It was active participation in determining what that something becomes. The observer and the observed were entangled in a way that made the clean boundary between them impossible to maintain. This is now called quantum entanglement, and it is one of the most experimentally confirmed results in all of modern physics. But here is what almost nobody has done with that confirmation. Almost nobody has taken it seriously as a description of how consciousness actually operates in a human life. Almost nobody has looked at quantum entanglement and asked the most obvious question available. If particles remain connected regardless of distance, if observation changes what is observed, if the boundary between the observer and the observed is not as clean as we assumed, then what does that mean about the mind doing the observing? What does it mean about the relationship between the consciousness that is experiencing a life and the life being experienced? That is the territory we are entering right now. And to enter it properly, I need to introduce you to someone whose story is going to carry us through everything that follows. Her name, for the purposes of this video, is Diana. Diana was 41 years old when the situation I want to describe began, and she had spent the better part of a decade doing everything the personal development industry told her to do. She had journaled every morning. She had meditated, first with guided recordings and then in silence. She had done therapy with a skilled practitioner who helped her understand how her childhood had shaped her patterns. She had done visualization and intention setting and gratitude practices and breathwork and somatic exercises and at least 4 different coaching programs, each offering a slightly different vocabulary for the same general project of becoming a better, freer, more actualized version of herself. And in her outer circumstances, things had objectively improved. Her career, which had been chaotic and unfocused in her 30s, had stabilized into something with real momentum. Her finances were healthier. She had ended a relationship that had been slowly diminishing her and built, over several careful years, a social world that actually nourished her. From the outside, from the perspective of anyone who had known her a decade earlier, Diana's life looked like a genuine success story. But Diana knew something that the outside view could not capture. Underneath all of it, beneath the improved circumstances and the hard-won stability, there was something that none of the tools had touched. A frequency, a hum, a quality of experience that persisted with remarkable consistency regardless of how much the outer conditions shifted. It was not depression. It was not the kind of anxiety that interferes with function. It was something more subtle and in some ways more frustrating precisely because of its subtlety. It was the persistent sense of watching her own life through glass, of being present for every moment but genuinely arrived at almost none of them, of something essential about the experience of being alive, happening on a channel she could not quite tune into, no matter how many techniques she applied or how diligently she did the inner work. She had described this feeling to her therapist. She had written about it in her journal. She had mentioned it in her coaching programs where the response was always some version of keep going, trust the process, the breakthrough is coming. And she had kept going. She had trusted the process. She had waited for the breakthrough. And the breakthrough had not come. Not the real one. Not the one that would reach down to wherever this persistent glass wall quality was coming from and dissolve it. What finally stopped her was not a new practice or a new teacher. It was a description of a physics experiment. She encountered it during a period when, out of exhausted curiosity, she had started reading about quantum mechanics, not the pop science version, but actual descriptions of actual experiments. She was not looking for spiritual validation. She was genuinely curious in the way a person gets curious when they have run out of answers in familiar territory and start looking beyond its edges. The experiment she encountered is called the Delayed Choice Quantum Eraser. And I want to walk you through it carefully because the strangeness is not in the interpretation. The strangeness is in what the experiment literally shows. It begins with the double slit experiment, the central mystery of quantum physics for nearly a century. Particles of light called photons are fired one at a time toward a barrier with 2 slits. When no measurement is made of which slit each photon passes through, something impossible happens by classical logic. Even though photons are fired one at a time, the pattern that builds up on the detector screen is an interference pattern, the kind only produced by waves, as if each single photon passes through both slits simultaneously and interferes with itself. The single particle, in the absence of observation, behaves like a wave of probability spread across every possible path available to it. But the moment a detector is added to measure which slit each photon uses, the interference pattern disappears. The act of observation changes what the photon actually does. The delayed choice quantum eraser goes further in a way that breaks the mind if you follow it honestly. In this version, the measurement is placed after the photons have already passed through the slits and produced their pattern on the detector screen. The measurement is made retroactively, and when it is made, the pattern already recorded on the screen changes. The interference pattern, the record of events that already happened, reorganizes to match the result of the future measurement. The present observation reaches backward in time and changes what the past event was. This is not a quirk of interpretation. The future measurement changes the past result. The direction of causality does not hold at the quantum level. And since quantum mechanics is the most precisely confirmed theory in the history of science, the implication is not that the experiment is wrong. The implication is that what we assumed about time, causality, and the independence of reality from the observer is fundamentally incomplete. Diana sat with this for 3 days, not reading more about it, not trying to find explanations that would make it less strange, just sitting with it, letting her mind attempt and repeatedly fail to resolve it into something her existing framework could contain. And on the 3rd day, something happened that she later described as the ground shifting under everything she thought she understood about her own life. She realized that if a future observation could change a past result, then the relationship between consciousness and time was not what she had been assuming. And if that relationship was wrong, then the entire framework she had been using to understand why her life looked the way it did, built on the bedrock assumption that the past causes the present and the present causes the future, and consciousness is a passenger watching the whole thing unfold, was at minimum missing something enormous. She started asking a different kind of question. Not how do I change my future, but what if the quality of observation I am bringing to the present is actively shaping what the past was for me? What if the glass wall she had been feeling between herself and her own experience was not a symptom of unresolved trauma or insufficient practice or some quality she lacked? What if it was the natural result of a specific configuration of consciousness, a specific quality of observation, one that, like the detector in the double-slit experiment, was collapsing the infinite field of her possible experience into a narrow band of familiar probabilities, every day, automatically, without her ever having been taught that this was what she was doing. This is where the law becomes visible, and this is where I need to give you the scientific foundation that makes it something other than a beautiful idea. Max Planck, the man who founded quantum theory, the physicist whose work made possible everything from the transistor to the laser to the medical imaging technology that saves millions of lives every year, said something in 1931 that is almost never quoted in the places where it most deserves to be heard. He said that he regarded consciousness as fundamental. That matter was derivative from consciousness, not the other way around. The man who spent his entire career investigating the deepest available level of physical reality did not conclude that matter produced mind. He concluded that mind was prior to matter, that the physical world was not the source of consciousness, but an expression of it. Werner Heisenberg wrote that what we observe is not nature itself, but nature exposed to our method of questioning. The thing being studied is not independent of the study. What reality reveals depends on what questions consciousness brings to it. John von Neumann, who produced the most rigorous mathematical formulation of quantum mechanics ever written, concluded through pure mathematics that the collapse of the wave function, the moment when a probability becomes an actuality, requires the intervention of a conscious observer, not a detector, not a measuring instrument, a conscious observer. He eliminated every possible alternative, and what remained was consciousness as the irreducible element in the process by which potential becomes real. These are not fringe thinkers or spiritual teachers dressing up metaphysical beliefs in scientific language. These are the architects of the most precisely confirmed scientific theory in human history. reporting what their own work led them to conclude. And what they concluded, arriving from the mathematics rather than from any spiritual commitment, was that consciousness is not a bystander in the universe. It is a participant, a determinative one. The observer does not simply record what is there. The observer participates in determining what is there. You are the mechanism. Your consciousness is not watching the movie. Your consciousness is the projector, and the specific configuration of awareness you bring to any moment determines which possibilities from the infinite quantum field collapse into the specific lived experience of that moment. This is the law. Stated plainly, without softening it or hedging it into vagueness. What you consistently observe with genuine attention and sustained emotional investment, you collapse into greater reality. What you withdraw your genuine observation from begins to dissolve back into the field of potential. You are not attracting your reality in the way a magnet attracts iron filings. You are not vibrating at a frequency and drawing matching frequencies toward you. You are doing something more fundamental and more precise than either of those metaphors captures. You are collapsing probability. You are the observer whose measurement function determines which state from the superposition of all possible states becomes the actual state of your experienced life. Now I want to show you what this means in the specific texture of an ordinary day, because the gap between a quantum physics experiment and a Tuesday morning is where most people lose the thread. The jump seems too large, but the mechanism is identical. The scale is different. The principle is the same. Every morning when you wake up, before you have consciously chosen anything at all, your consciousness is already performing its primary function. Your nervous system scans the environment of your experience, both the inner environment of your emotional and mental state and the outer environment of your circumstances, and it begins collapsing probabilities. The emotional tone that settles into your body in the first minutes after waking is not random. It is not purely the product of how well you slept or what is scheduled for your day. It is the result of your consciousness performing its default measurement function, selecting from the vast field of possible experience the specific configuration that matches the frequency of your most deeply habitual attention. If your most habitual attention is oriented toward problems, your observation function is calibrated to collapse problems out of the field. Not because problems are all that exist, because problems are what your measurement apparatus is tuned to register. If your attention habitually gravitates toward evidence that you are not enough, or that the world is fundamentally resistant, or that good things arrive for other people by mechanisms unavailable to you, then that is the specific probability your consciousness keeps selecting. Not because that is all that is in the field, because that is what a consciousness configured the way yours is configured consistently collapses into reality. Here is the part that makes this both harder and more hopeful than it sounds. The configuration is not your fault. The measurement apparatus your consciousness is running was not something you consciously designed. It was calibrated over years of experience, most of it happening before you had the self-awareness to notice what was being encoded. The emotional frequencies that feel like reality to you, the ones that seem to simply be accurate perceptions of how things are, rather than a particular filter applied to an infinite field, were installed through repetition. Through the accumulated weight of experience, telling your nervous system what to expect and therefore what to measure for. The configuration is not a character flaw. It is not evidence of spiritual inadequacy. It is a calibration, and calibrations can be recalibrated. This was Diana's realization. 3 days after the delayed choice quantum eraser experiment first rearranged her understanding of causality, she did something she had never quite done before in her decade of personal development work. She stopped trying to change the content of her experience and started examining the quality of the observer doing the experiencing. She stopped asking, "What do I need to do differently?" and started asking, "What is the frequency of attention I am actually bringing to my life right now?" Not the frequency I intend to bring, not the frequency I cultivate during my morning practice and then lose within 40 minutes of starting my day, but the actual default frequency of observation that runs automatically beneath everything else. What she found was not dramatic. It was quiet and precise, like adjusting a camera's focus until what was blurred becomes suddenly clear. The quality of attention she had been bringing to her life for years, The frequency that felt like simple, honest observation of reality was saturated with a specific expectation. The expectation of being slightly apart from things, slightly outside the full warmth of any experience, behind a layer of glass from her own life. She had spent years trying to change her outer circumstances while this expectation ran continuously at the level of the observer itself. And the observer, as quantum mechanics confirms, is the mechanism that determines what gets collapsed from the field into reality. She had been editing the outputs, while the input, the fundamental quality of her observation, had remained untouched. When she began working with the observer directly rather than with the observed, things shifted in ways that bypassed her existing framework for understanding change. Not gradually and incrementally, the way change tends to work when you are improving outer conditions. Rapidly and structurally, the way things shift when the mechanism generating the conditions is what changes. The glass wall quality began dissolving not because her circumstances became better, but because the consciousness meeting those circumstances was arriving differently, more present, more genuinely open to what was actually there rather than pre-configured to find what it had always found before. And as the quality of the observer shifted, the field responded. It collapsed different probabilities, not because it had been holding them in reserve, waiting for her to become worthy of them, but because a different observer, by definition, collapses a different reality from the same infinite field. I want to give you the practical mechanism now, because everything I have described becomes either a tool or just another interesting idea, depending entirely on whether you can translate it into something you actually do with your consciousness. And the translation is not complicated. It is just unfamiliar in a way that takes deliberate effort to sustain until it becomes natural. The most important distinction you need to understand for working with your observation function deliberately is the difference between attention and awareness. These two words get used interchangeably, and they are not the same thing. Attention is focused, it is directional, it is the searchlight, it moves towards specific objects and illuminates them while leaving everything else in the dark. Awareness is something else entirely. It is diffuse, it is receptive. It is the quality of being present to the full field of experience rather than to a selected object within it. Attention is effortful. Awareness is the opposite of effortful. It is what remains when you stop directing attention anywhere in particular and simply allow consciousness to rest in its natural open state. This distinction matters because the quantum field does not respond to the intensity of your focused attention. You cannot stare harder at the reality you want and collapse it into being through sheer concentration. What the field responds to is the configuration of consciousness that is doing the observing. And the configuration is not determined by where you direct your attention. It is determined by the quality of awareness you are bringing to the entire act of observing. A consciousness saturated with the expectation of lack will collapse lack regardless of how intensely it focuses on abundance. The frequency of the observer overrides the content of what the observer is looking at. This is why positive thinking on its own does not work the way its proponents claim. You cannot override the observer's frequency by instructing it to focus on different content. The frequency has to change. And frequency is not a matter of content. It is a matter of the quality of awareness itself. Now think about the moments in your life, and I am certain they exist, when something genuinely good appeared without effort. A connection that arrived without you seeking it. An opportunity that presented itself through a channel you had not been monitoring. A solution to a problem you had set down and stopped actively working on. An insight that came fully formed in the space between tasks or in the unfocused clarity of a walk or in the suspended awareness of those first minutes after waking before the day's programming fully loads. What do those moments have in common? Almost without exception, they share a single quality. You were not trying. You were not in searchlight mode, scanning the field for what you needed. You were in a state of open awareness, and in that openness, the field collapsed something that the focused striving mode had been systematically preventing. This is not an argument against effort. It is not a recommendation to stop working toward what matters to you. It is a description of where in the process of collapsing reality, each mode of consciousness is actually useful. Open awareness is how new possibilities enter the field of your experience. Focused attention is how you execute on a possibility that has already arrived. Most people have these completely inverted. They spend virtually all their conscious time in focused attention mode, analyzing and planning and reviewing and strategizing, and they wonder why they keep finding the same possibilities available to them no matter how hard they work. They are not giving the field any space in which to collapse something genuinely new because they are filling every available moment of consciousness with the narrow beam of what they already expect to find. They run the detector constantly and wonder why the wave function never shows them anything new. The practice I am suggesting is this. Begin identifying the small pockets of your day where open awareness is actually available to you. The transition moments. The drive where you are not on a call. The few minutes before sleep when the day has stopped demanding things. The meal where you are not simultaneously processing information. The walk where you are not planning the rest of your afternoon. These moments exist in every life, even the busiest ones. And in most lives, they are immediately filled with the same focused attention mode that runs everywhere else, with reviewing what just happened, planning what comes next, monitoring internal emotional weather, checking in with the familiar frequencies of expectation and concern that feel like staying on top of things, but are actually just running the default measurement apparatus on continuous loop. What I am asking you to do with those moments is different. Not to meditate in them, not to practice anything formal or technique-based in them, but to genuinely set down the searchlight, to allow your awareness to be present to the full field of your experience without directing it anywhere in particular. To practice the quality of not knowing what the moment should contain and letting it contain what it actually contains. This is more difficult than it sounds because the default mode is so habitual that the mind returns to it almost immediately. But even brief, genuine interruptions of the default, even 10 or 15 seconds of actually clean open awareness, begin to recalibrate the observer, begin to shift the frequency. And a shifted frequency collapses different probabilities, not eventually, immediately, because the quantum field does not operate on a delay. It responds to the observer that is actually present right now. There is a deeper layer to this that I have been holding back for a specific reason. I have been building toward it since the very first question I asked you at the beginning of this video, the one about what preceded the last real change in your life. I told you that the people who change most completely all describe the same internal event before the external shift, a change in what they were willing to see. I want to give you the quantum mechanics of why that is true, because it is not a psychological observation. It is a description of a specific mechanism. Willingness to see is not simply a virtue or a psychological capacity. It is an observer configuration. When you become genuinely willing to see something you were previously unwilling to see, your observation function changes. The frequency of your consciousness shifts at the level of the observer itself, not at the level of the content being observed. And a consciousness that is configured to look honestly at something it previously filtered out is a different observer than it was before. A different observer collapses different probabilities, every time. This is why every genuine transformation in human experience, regardless of what tradition or framework it is described in, comes back to the same root event. The willingness to see what is actually there rather than what the habitual observer was calibrated to find. This is also why transformation cannot be forced. Willingness to see something new does not arrive through effort or discipline. It emerges when the cost of not seeing becomes greater than the discomfort of seeing. It arrives when the familiar observer configuration has generated enough evidence of its own limitation that the consciousness carrying it becomes more motivated by the possibility of something different than it is defended by the comfort of the known. You cannot rush that moment, but you can stop filling every available space with distraction, stop providing the habitual observer with enough new content that it never has to confront its own configuration. In the space that creates, willingness tends to find its way in. Now I want to address directly the statistic in the title of this video because it deserves more than a passing reference. When I say that only 1% will ever understand this quantum law, I am not talking about intellectual comprehension. You can comprehend this intellectually. You have been comprehending it for the last several minutes. Comprehension is not the threshold. The threshold is something harder and rarer than comprehension. The threshold is the willingness to actually become a different observer rather than to understand, admire, share, and then continue observing from exactly the same configuration as before. The research on genuine transformation, not incremental improvement of existing patterns, but the kind of structural change that reorganizes how a person moves through their life at a fundamental level, consistently shows that a very small fraction of the people who encounter transformative ideas actually allow those ideas to change the observer, rather than simply adding to the observed content. Most people encounter a powerful concept, feel the resonance, perhaps share it, build it into their intellectual framework, and then continue experiencing life from the same observer configuration they arrived with. The concept becomes part of what they know without ever becoming part of how they see. The 1% is not smarter. It is not more spiritually gifted. It does not have access to information that the 99% lacks. The 1% is more willing to let the encounter with a true thing actually change the observer rather than just add to the observed. Willing to sit in the genuine discomfort of examining how their own habitual observation function has been generating the reality they have been getting rather than reaching immediately for the more comfortable story that the reality is something happening to them from outside. Willing to become different before the evidence arrives that different is working. Because at the quantum level, the evidence comes after the observer changes, not before. The changed observer is what creates the changed evidence. And trusting that sequence, changing the projector before you can see the new film on the screen, requires a quality of willingness that most people, most of the time, find more uncomfortable than simply staying in the familiar configuration and hoping the outputs improve. You have stayed through this entire video. Something in you is already pointed toward the willingness I am describing. The question is whether you are going to let that orientation become an actual change in the observer. A genuine recalibration of the measurement function collapsing your daily reality, or whether you are going to let it become another video you watched once that sounded like it meant something. If you are ready for it to become something real, the Quantum Collapse Reconfiguration course is the structured system for making that happen. Not as inspiration, as a working process for actually examining the specific configuration of your observation function, identifying the precise frequencies that have been generating your default reality, and rewriting them at the level where the collapse actually occurs. 5 modules, step by step, the mechanism made practical, and the collapse. 2026 ebook is there for every day that follows, a daily guide for carrying this law into lived practice through every month of this year, rather than holding it as a concept you revisit occasionally. Both are in the description. The links are there right now. The quantum field is waiting for a changed observer. The probabilities that belong to the version of your life you have been sensing is possible, the one that feels just slightly out of reach, just slightly on the other side of something you have not quite been able to identify. Those probabilities are not being withheld from you. They are in the field right now, alongside every other possibility, waiting to be collapsed into reality by an observer configured to receive them. You are not missing the right circumstances, or the right technique, or the right amount of effort. You are one configuration change away from being the observer that collapses them. The law does not care how long you have been running the old configuration. It responds only to the observer that is present right now. Change who is watching. And watch with the precise and undeniable confirmation that quantum mechanics has been offering since 1982. What changes?